Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the BoogieBoard Tiki Bar. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ian Westbrook. He is a go-to-market wizard who has had an awesome career with a ton of different companies, high growth, high scale. He's kind of seen it all, and he's doing a lot of cool work today. So, Ian, thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, everyone gets the same first question when we open up the Tiki Bar. Nobody plans to be in go-to-market in really any capacity. So what did young Ian want to be when he grew up?
My first recollection was actually I wanted to be a real life cowboy. Now, for me, it wasn't too much of a far-fetched idea, being a young and impressionable kid that was growing up on the windswept plains of Wyoming. It wasn't too far-fetched to want to do that. But for many years as a youngster, I thought that was really the route to go. Although I'm pleased with the route that I ended up taking, which was quite divergent from those initial thoughts. But yeah, my first recollection was that's really what I wanted to do.
That's interesting. And so growing up in Wyoming, and I know in Denver as well, were you into the outdoors? Were you riding horses and things like that? Or how close to cowboyhood did you take it?
I didn't take it too close, but yeah, the outdoors were always just a part of what we did, and still today, still a big part of what I do and what I do with my family. And there's a lot of outdoors that we get involved with, whether that be fly fishing or skiing or backpacking or anything outdoors. I mean, it's so readily available here that you have to take advantage of it if you're close to it.
Yeah, cowboy adjacent. I like that.
Yes.
So what was the story of your first job? The first time you caught a paycheck, what were you doing?
First time I caught a paycheck was with a mowing service. And it was actually a really good experience because I did that for several summers. And being with just a very small crew, it was a gentleman that was a little bit older than me, and he was going out there and hustling for leads on where whose lawns we could mow and whose lawns we could take care of at the time. Just understanding how all of that came together at a very young age of like, hey, if we put this together and we provide good customer service and we do a good quality job, that there's going to be a lot more jobs for us next season. It was a really good and I think fun way to start to learn about business and start to learn about the importance of customers and just also the fruits of a lot of hard work, because when it's really hot outside and you're having to do that kind of work, you certainly enjoy the paycheck.
Absolutely. I did that job as well as a landscaper, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
You kind of get a nice workout, and some days are maybe a little much. You get to spend some time outside and kind of make some good art in the process. Are you doing push lawn mowing? You on a rider? Were you fancy with it? What was the setup?
It was push lawnmower at first, and then graduated to a riding lawnmower. And I agree with you. One of the benefits of that type of work is that you really get to step back and actually see something that you've done. And not to disparage other kinds of work, but I think if you're involved in SaaS, for instance, for a long, long time, there's different elements of how you step back and you appreciate the work that you've done. There's a real sort of tacit feeling to seeing something that you've done with your hands effectively, and being able to step back from that. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that is one of the challenging parts about the software landscape is you're often a few degrees removed even from something that happens in the real world.
Yeah.
So what was your first experience with sales or selling something? Did it happen at the lawn mowing company or later in life?
It did there, but I think in reality, I had a paper route as well. And so that was definitely sales, because then you also had collections where you had to go around and collect the fees, or at least for the paper that I delivered for. But, I think in all honesty, I was early in my career. I had been out of grad school for a couple of years, and I got the opportunity to actually initially dip my toe in the water with sales engineering. And so I had been an account manager, and I was seeing that the salespeople at the company that I was with, they were making a lot more money. And so I was pretty interested in that, and I had the opportunity for a sales engineering role. And I did that briefly. And part of the reason I did it briefly is that not too long after I had accepted a role as a sales engineer within the same company, a couple of roles for sales director or account executive type roles came available, and I jumped on that and found it to be really rewarding. And so my first real taste of sales came in SaaS or in software, first as an account manager, and then a sales engineer, and then an actual. So that was my.
Do you have any battle scars from an early deal or an early customer experience that taught you the ropes in a challenging way?
My first sales call as an account executive was actually with Microsoft. We would later be acquired by Microsoft, but at the time they were a customer. And I just remember this on the other end of the line was a director level individual. Again, I'm very young and this is early in my career. This is probably the first sales call that I was really leading. And this individual really took me to task as a buyer. And I remember walking out of the room, it did not go well, realizing like, okay, I've got a pretty steep hill in front of me to actually understand how I'm going to be successful at this thing and how I'm going to navigate tough conversations. And how I'm going to be able to come out of the other side of it with, I don't know, some sort of commercial agreement, even if that commercial agreement is to meet again or to go through a demo or whatever that might be. But, or I should say commercial outcome to the conversation. But yeah, I think if you've done sales for long enough, you end up experiencing the good and the bad days. And, when you come in second place and all of the work that you're pouring into it, especially in enterprise sales, where you might have a sales cycle that's, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, potentially over a year, it really start to understand how you're going to manage how you react to situations.
Yeah.
When you come up with goose eggs in second place versus being on the highest highs when you get some of those big deals across the line.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's lots of ups and downs if you do it for long enough.
Yes, you have to understand how to weather the downs. I've had many of those in my day, and you kind of learn to trust the process. And when that little bubble of anxiety builds up, you go for a run or do whatever it is that gets you back in the swing of things. Yeah. And I'm curious.
What I will say, Kevin, is that, I was very fortunate at a couple different junctures to have really good managers and be in environments where I had really good managers. And those managers that were the best were those that were very explicitly teaching me or articulating to me and others that it is a process and that you can control a lot of elements that go into that process, but you can't control the outcome. And, if you have a successful formula and you have a successful process, you'll come up winning more often than those who don't. And I think it's that emotional security that's provided by great leadership to be able to go out there, know that you executed, and sometimes it's just not going to fall in your favor, and that those people have your back to go out there and execute it again and go find some wins. So I was very fortunate in that regard.
No, I love that. I think that's going to come up again when we talk about kind of measuring the process related to performance. But before that, looking through your LinkedIn, it clearly worked out for you. You were doing pretty well. You moved up in sales, and then you moved into enablement and into operations. And so I'm curious, you've done solutions engineering work, you've done direct selling work, customer relationship work, enablement, operations. What gave you the curiosity bug to keep on trying new things?
Yeah, there was a couple of pieces, actually two primary pieces that led me to a change over to enablement and operations specifically. And that was, number one, my wife and I had our first child. And so at the time, I had been in enterprise sales for some time, and I was looking to make a lifestyle change, get off the road because I was traveling a lot. So that played a real role in making a very conscious decision around how I was valuing that family time and how I wanted those values to be reflected in what it was that I was doing. And then the second element of that is that I had both intellectual curiosity about enablement and operations and strategy. And I was also fortunate enough to have been part of organizations where I, as a seller, was a consumer of really good enablement and really good revenue operations. And through that, there were several mentors who are still mentors today that I look up to, that between the intellectual curiosity and seeing how it could be done really, really effectively, tip the scales to, okay, hey, now's the time to make that transition and really pursue some of that curiosity and look to learn and in some places mimic what I had seen as being highly impactful in the organizations that I had been a part of and things that I had seen as being highly effective at scale. And so that's what really led me to make a bigger shift from enterprise sales over into enablement and operations and strategy.
What did it feel like to be a consumer of good enablement? It sounds like you recognized that when you were a seller, not just after you got into producing enablement and realizing how hard it was. When you're actually consuming it and you're like, this is good, I'm getting something from this. What did that feel like?
Well, I would share a couple of different observations. And that is, number one, I always had the sense that my managers were better at the thing that I was doing than I was. And again, I happen to be fortunate because they were also good coaches that held me accountable to getting better at that thing as well. And so what I started to realize from an enablement lens, even when I was consuming that enablement, is that it wasn't purely focused on the seller, in that case me, but it was also focused on, how those managers are actually being equipped to be the best at it. Oftentimes when you look at, a 1-to-8 ratio for a frontline manager to sellers, that frontline manager is going to have far more at-bats in different conversations than any individual seller will, just by the numbers of conversations that they would be involved in. And so naturally, those good managers are going to become very, very good at having conversations that are structured in a way that maybe you have a sales methodology that the company has adopted, that they become more adept to that faster than some of the sellers themselves. And so I think the first observation was, gosh, my manager is a lot better at this than I am. And how can I start to mimic and mirror what they're doing? And oh, by the way, there's enough of an accountability structure in place that they're holding me accountable to executing in that same way too. And really upping my game and how I'm showing up in order to be successful more times than.
That's awesome. And was there a point where it clicked for you that this was the right thing for you? Because from then on, you go on to some pretty awesome, operations and enablement heights. When did you know it worked?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe I'll articulate a challenge that I saw where it clicked in my mind of, oh, we can do a lot better here. And that was, I was witness to and to some extent party to a technology adoption. It was an enablement technology or a sales tech stack solution that it was a great solution. The technology itself was phenomenal. It was the right decision to buy the solution. And ultimately, the adoption rates over the course of 18 months dipped down to 20, 30%. And I think that was the point in witnessing that. I was a very ancillary, tangential player in that, but seeing that happen and some of the circumstances around that scenario, which I believe is, well, actually I know now is very, very common at organizations. That's when it really clicked for me of there is a better way to do this. There are fundamentals in how these things can be laid out, how they can be integrated, how they can be thought about that have a dramatic impact on both the adoption of a solution, but I think more importantly, what's the behavioral change at scale that results in having a large impact from making an investment like that and getting a much better return on that investment. And so that was kind of my aha moment. Like, okay, yeah,
that's interesting.
There's definitely something here that can be done.
That's interesting. You saw it through the impact. I love that. So then how did you get hooked up with DocuSign? Can you take me through just kind of where the company was at that time, what you were initially hired to do?
Yeah. So, I at the time, the COO at DocuSign, a gentleman by the name of Scott Ulrich, had a vision of what he wanted to see, and I think it was a great vision of where the company could go in terms of these aren't his words, these are my words, but really becoming more mature and refined and iterative in how sales was executed. It was a company that had, still today has phenomenal product market fit, had grown tremendously, had recently gone through an IPO when I joined. And so, it was through his vision and the vision of another individual, Andrew Riesenfeld, that really I was able to, and I was tapped to help come in and refine both the effectiveness of the field practice as well as the maturity of some of the infrastructure around sales process. And so it was a very unique opportunity to go into an organization that was already at scale, that had phenomenal product market fit in order to ultimately mature some of those things. Upon arrival, and certainly in retrospect, what I think anybody who has done a large scale digital transformation knows is that at organizations that are large or at scale, transformations take time. They're often very complex. And in going through that process on multiple occasions, you learn a lot of what's going to be effective and sort of where you need to start placing your cards depending upon the size of the organization and the level of maturity of the organization. And so that was the challenge in front of me and in front of the team that I built, was to navigate some of those challenges in order to drive impact, which we ended up taking a very unique route in terms of the type of team that we built and how we executed on an operating model that I introduced. And ultimately, we drove significant change and a significant impact at a large scale company, which was really exciting to see.
But what made your approach to it unique? When you say there was a kind of a unique team structure, a unique idea behind what you're trying to do, What was the difference there?
Yeah, so at the time, what ultimately became instituted was I took a model which was diagnose, design, instrument, measure, activate, and govern. And I took that as an operating model. And again, I had a unique opportunity to build a team from scratch. So I took that model and through the vision of Scott and Andrew and others, was able to execute on, okay, well, how do we source for different roles that are appropriate for each one of those buckets where they would have a focus? And it gave a very unique opportunity to use or to bring on really high level and great UX researchers in the diagnose phase, right? That could go out there and engage with the field and really exercise the practice of really great UX research. People like we had Six Sigma black belts for our process design. We had director level business systems analysts. Pardon me. We had senior level data analysts and program managers. And so it was a very unique team in the way that we had basically looked at the industry and said, okay, hey, how do we take practices that are very mature in terms of process design, in terms of UX research, or fairly mature, and how do we start to apply them to go to market specifically? And how do we do that in a way that is somewhat unique in order to drive impact at scale for a company that's 2 billion in revenue? And how do we run that through an operating model that is fairly unique in order to, again, drive large scale behavioral change and drive impact at scale across multiple global regions, across thousands of people? And so we took a fairly unique approach to how we were doing that. And I think we failed at times, because anytime you do something for the first time, there's going to be struggles. And I think we got it right. And we started to get it really right the more and more that we started to execute on it. And it was just a really phenomenal team. There's still individuals at DocuSign who are carrying that flag that are doing a phenomenal job as well. And so it was a very unique.
So when you talk about the things that did work, I'm curious if a story comes to mind. You've got these Six Sigma black belts in here, evaluating process, which I think is really unique for a growing software company at that time. You've got UX happening. And so really taking a different approach to this. I'm curious if there's like a micro example of something that worked where you can shed some light on it for us.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of areas where it really worked. I think one of the areas I would share is probably with maybe I'll discuss a couple of core concepts that really worked well. And that was, I think, as you do things at scale at large organizations, it requires not only really good design, but it also requires a really healthy dose of strong communication strategy and really strong change management. Now, that formula changes depending upon the size of the organization and also the level of maturity of processes and accountability structures. In the case that this team was built, it was an organization that was at scale and it had phenomenal product market fit. And there were areas in the business at that time that were less mature, meaning that, and this is very common, it's not specific to that organization, but it's fairly common to find solutions, especially in the tech space, where the product market fit and the focus on going out there where there's a lot of demand, there's a fairly large TAM, that it starts to outpace the infrastructure behind it that's really supporting it. And so part of the job is, hey, how do we build infrastructure to try and catch up to where the organization is? And so a really good example of that would be designing accountability structures that can be embedded within the operational rhythm of the sales organization. And what do I mean by accountability structures? Well, taking a framework like the REX framework, which is something that the folks at Winning by Design help spearhead, but REX stands for results, efforts, knowledge, and skills. How do you take that and start to operationalize it on a quarterly basis so that every frontline manager across the globe and 5 global regions across thousands of people, that every frontline manager has all of the tools necessary to assess not just the results of the sellers on their team, but what are the efforts, knowledge, and skills that each individual is displaying on a quarterly basis, and what does every frontline manager do in order to effectively coach and manage to those efforts, knowledge, and skills in order to elevate the performance of the company. I think that would be an example of something being embedded into the operational rhythm, where having really good UX research to understand how people are doing it differently, to understand where there are friction points, and having really good process design to understand how it can be embedded into the operational rhythm, and having really good systems integration to understand, okay, hey, here's how the tools are going to be built or supplied to these managers and leadership in order to understand what's going on. It's things like that having built the go-to-market process strategy and design function represent a really good example of like, here's what's possible. And, here's how really great design and really great execution can drive a lot of impact for a scaled business.
I love that example. Can I ask you the converse? Do you have a failure story of something you tried with experimentation that just didn't work?
Yeah. I think anytime you're trying something, you try and get better each time that you go after it. And, there were several times where the observation of, if we think about a simple pie chart, what had been built and we were executing on, there were really great designs that had been built, but in the absence or with not enough effective communication strategy and program management and change management, the adoption of those things really struggled. And I think it took us a few iterations to really understand, okay, hey, what's the right mix between those elements of designing something great, but then also making sure that there's enough structure in place around change management and effective communication to really win the hearts and minds of people, and how it's going to help them on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis to ultimately affect their goals. I think it took us a while to get there on that. And there were some pretty hard lessons of a lot of really great effort that didn't have the impact that we were looking for, that ultimately we had to take that and learn from that and then iterate and improve upon. And so there were a healthy number of those situations. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say too, Kevin, that, the other thing that when you have an organization that is at scale, and when I say at scale, I'm saying, you've got multiple regions, you potentially have thousands of people that, are going through a change. When you go to introduce some amount of standardization, and that standardization is really meant to assist the business as a whole to be more predictable, and that predictability holds value. That when you go to do something like that, you quickly find that a certain percentage of the organization is doing it far better than that standard. And then on the other end of that spectrum, some amount of the organization is not doing the thing at all. And so if we think about it in simple terms, let's say you've designed something that's somewhere in the middle of that, and you're trying to bring those who are not doing any of that up to that thing. And you're potentially having to kind of put on your sales hat and sell the idea of those who are actually doing it far better, that there's some elements of what they're having to do that they're going to have to meet that standard. There's a lot of complexity in sort of what that change management, how you win the hearts and minds of people to actually get that large scale behavioral change in order to do that kind of thing. And so there's inherently just a lot of complexity that goes along with that. And that leaves a lot of room for a lot of lessons to be learned, both in what works and what might not work in those types of environments.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that kind of leads into one of your hypotheses that we talked about, is that companies that are more mature in process, so would get those Six Sigma black belts pretty excited, are actually better positioned to leverage AI. And I think that that might be converse to what some people think, is you think of the nimble startup with no existing process that can experiment, and therefore they're ready to roll right away. But you're viewing the mature process as actually an unlock for AI. Can you take me through that thought?
Yeah. So a couple of things around process itself. And that is, if we think about process maturity, the good news is we can stand on the shoulders of some really great thought leaders in the industry around how we can look at process maturity. And so one common framework is to look at process maturity as to whether or not a process is ad hoc, informal, formal, or dynamic. There's other mechanisms, and some of those pieces have been worked on and updated, but just for the purpose of simplicity, we'll think about those four categories. If we think about those four categories and we apply definition to those four categories, we can then start to say, okay, as an example, for a process to be considered formal in our organization, it has to be a process that's well documented. It has to be a process that has strong adoption, and it has to be a process that is reviewed at scale on a regular basis. Pretty simple. If we take that same premise and we then apply some of the elements of your question around how can we take advantage of AI, the hypothesis being is that those organizations who are more formalized and formalized in the definition that I just described, that they will be more quickly adept at understanding, okay, where do we have friction points in our process? Where can we apply AI to have the most impact in that process? Because again, we already have our process documented, we already know that it's adhered to, and we're already reviewing it and iterating on it at scale, we're going to be in a much more nimble position to actually drive much greater impact than if we, say, take an organization who maybe with the best of intentions, everybody's kind of doing their own thing in an ad hoc basis. Now, when I go to apply an AI solution, that might work for one team, but it doesn't necessarily work for the other 4, 5, 6, however other many segments or teams that I have, because they're fundamentally doing things in a different way. They might be very successful in what they're doing, but that's an environment that has a high degree of variability, and the opportunity to apply AI in order to enhance what they're doing is much more complicated, and I think much more suspect to the impact that they're actually going to get out of it. And so the level of maturity does have an impact in terms of, well, it does have an influence on how impactful AI initiatives will be and how quickly those impact of those AI initiatives will actually start to return results.
No, that makes a ton of sense, man. I'm thinking about a process that we're running right now on the data aggregation and prospecting side. And,
well, I was just going to say, one other thing that comes to mind is, and we're still in the early days in terms of, generally speaking, of AI adoption within go-to-market. And, a couple of, I think, key elements that have come out of these early days is trying to understand AI's impact on a couple of different levels. And I'm going to share these, Kevin, in relation to process. And so if we break that down into three very, relatively simple levels. Number one is, how do we use AI to transform some of our processes? And when I mean this is that, let's just say you have a prospecting process, and let's say it's mature, and you're, it's fairly formal, but you can use AI to, do some fairly straightforward things. You can buy AI off the shelf, call summaries, deal insights, account research, things of that nature. Great. Again, the more mature you are, the much easier it is to buy something off the shelf and plug it in and understand the impact you're going to get from it. But then we can start to we can graduate into bigger levels of like, okay, well, how do we apply AI to business transformation? Maybe we're looking at completely reforming how we're responding to RFPs, or we're looking to institute different assistants to help really with sales support from a RevOps perspective to get deals done faster. Again, the more mature any of those processes are, if they're documented, if they're well adhered to, and they're reviewed at scale, if you're in a position where that's the case, you're going to be able to apply business transformation in a more impactful way and in a quicker and more nimble way. And then it affords the opportunity to be thinking more on sort of a third level, which is organizational transformation. How do we reimagine where marketing and our inside sales teams are coming together, and how AI can start to augment some of those things? Much bigger types of questions and transformations than simply just the original level one process transformation. But again, each one of them can be fed by a level of maturity that really puts the organization in a position to take advantage of it very quickly and know the impact from it, and be able to iterate and think bigger than their competitors might be, who are doing things in a more ad hoc basis.
I'm going to talk about the team being able to take advantage of it, like you just said, because another thing that we talked about is accountability structures, and you mentioned rents, but I'm curious, what does a good accountability system look like in a modern go-to-market?
Well, maybe I'll answer the question focused on a specific audience, and maybe we'll focus it on sales. And it was my observation, and I'm sure it's not a unique observation, having sold for many, many years, that there were times in which the cards that were dealt to me weren't the most optimal, or I didn't feel as a seller they were the most optimal. Whether it be the accounts that I was assigned, whether it be the territory in which I could call on, sometimes being at organizations where that deck would be reshuffled on a yearly basis. And so when we come back to this question of accountability, it brings up I think one of the fundamental questions is the seller solely responsible for the outcome, or are they being evaluated in a more holistic way and held accountable in a more holistic way to how they're showing up day in and day out and executing on the job that they've been hired to do? And how, at least in terms of go-to-market process strategy and design, when we think about well-formed and highly mature accountability structures, those accountability structures have to be not only on the outcomes that, like win rates and ASP and quota attainment, but just as much on, again, the efforts, knowledge, and skills that a seller and an organization is showing up day in and day out. How are we thinking? How are we evaluating those things? How are we coaching to those things? How are we measuring those things? because sometimes the cards that get dealt to people aren't optimal, but the way that they show up and the effort that they put in and making sure that their skills are honed, those are all qualities that we want to be fostering within our sales organizations. And that's what a good, mature accountability structure holds within it, is that it looks at it holistically from results all the way through to those behaviors and skills and efforts, so that those can be applied uniformly or in a way that's fair to everybody involved. So hopefully that provides,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about, we do territory design, right? And so I think about how to kind of coach companies to think about that all the time, is that this is just a starting line that you're giving folks, and that there's a whole lot going on in the race than just the result. And it's hard because your quota is your quota, and it's hard to get anybody pulled back from that. So it's a difficult thing to say to your sales team if your end state compensation guide is black and white.
Yep. Exactly. It reminds me of a saying that I can't take credit for this saying, but the saying was basically in relation to a territory. Is the seller trying to grow a crop in the fertile, rich grounds of the Midwest, or are they trying to grow a crop in the Walmart parking lot? Right? That's an exaggeration, but I know through my selling days, and then certainly from an enablement, RevOps, and strategy perspective, some of the best sellers I've seen were people who were being called upon to do farming or to grow a crop in the Walmart parking lot. And because of their struggle and sort of the skills that they had to develop, they ultimately were better sellers than those where it was coming a little bit easier to them. And I think most people can relate to that on a humanistic level. And so, yeah, sometimes the cards aren't dealt to us in the best way. And I think that's what makes this time and go-to-market really exciting, is that there's now technologically a lot more opportunities to make more equitable situations where organizations can focus on some of those humanistic aspects of how they're going to ultimately help their sellers sell better and not have to worry as much about which cards are being dealt to them.
Ian, I'm going to start putting you on some BoogieBoard sales calls. That's what we'll say. I want to talk tech stacks, ironically, next. Many companies talk about tech stack bloat. It's a common thing to riff on LinkedIn, say, these tools cost X. We're not getting as much ROI out of them as they promised. I think you zoom in a lens further before making generalizations like that. So how do you think about the ROI of the tech stack?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think it's a very common struggle on both sides of the equation. I think it's a struggle for organizations to get the ROI that they're hoping for and the adoption that they're hoping for. And I think it's a struggle for the solution provider to get the adoption that they're hoping for, because they're wanting strong adoption. And a couple of things come to mind. Oftentimes when a leader is making a decision around a solution, I think it's very understandable at times that a black and white scenario gets painted for them of buy this and you get this result. And it's very understandable, especially when there's multiple priorities and there's a lot of pressure on creating impact and driving performance, to make a very black and white decision. Right? We're going to go out, we're going to solve this thing, we're going to buy a solution for that thing, and our expectation is that we're going to get the impact from that thing. That comes into contrast with how do you design effective processes where you go at it from a process first mindset that says, okay, here's what a seller is trying to execute on a daily basis, or a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And what are the tools within that process that amplify and or drive some amount of efficiency or drive some amount of impact for that seller to be using that solution at that particular juncture. And the reason why I say those two things come together is that a lot of organizations lack maturity in their process. And so that process hasn't been fully mapped out. It hasn't been documented. And even if it has, some of the adoption of that process is probably suspect. Yet leaders are having to make decisions in order to fulfill their fiduciary duty to the company of getting better results. And so you end up buying a solution and trying to plug it into a process that it may or may not fit really well in. And so I think that the first premise is having effective and mature processes ultimately will allow leadership and others to understand, well, what are the best tools? Where are the biggest friction points? And therefore, what are the tools that we need to go out and get that are going to yield the biggest impact, because they're going to have the biggest relief on those friction points. That's number one. And then number two is technology adoption or skill adoption or any of these things, the horizon of change is often longer than we want it to be. And there has to be a plan in place that even if it's a great technology and everybody loves it, it's still going to have a very long arc of what is the support and governance infrastructure to make sure that that thing is actually being used and that it's being used effectively. In the absence of those two things, of process maturity and process design and effective change management or governance of that thing, it's a rinse and repeat of you buy something and you're probably going to get a 20 to 30% adoption rate of that thing. If it's if it's a technology that is not mandatory. There are certain technologies that you'll get adoption of because you can't get a deal done with them.
Right. So you're doing work with a few different companies right now. I'm curious, what has you most excited? Where do you see the biggest opportunities? What are you excited to come in and learn about now?
Yeah, I think, I'm just as excited as anybody else about both the promise, but I think the real world application of AI within go-to-market. And I'm excited about the promise on two fronts. Number one is from a process lens, how can AI be leveraged in a strategic manner to make not only process transformation, but business transformation and organizational transformation. And those companies who have a more mature process infrastructure are going to be far better positioned to take advantage of that. So that's number one. And then number two is on the behavioral side of the possibilities of AI and its impact on improving or even just creating more focus on what are the humanistic aspects that we can change and the behavioral change at scale that we need in order to be successful as go-to-market organizations. The more you see the possibilities of AI from a agentic perspective, or even just from an automation perspective, trimming down the workloads of what a seller might need to be doing, the more you start to realize we can start to put more of an emphasis on how they're showing up as a human being, especially in enterprise sales, how they're showing up as a human being with other human beings in order to just be more effective sellers. And a lot of that is not new, but I think it gives a very unique opportunity to where we are as to how we can use AI to the advantage of how we improve some of those humanistic qualities in our go-to-market teams.
Absolutely. All right. Now, my last question, if you could give one piece of advice to someone starting out in RevOps or sales or just entering this world of go-to-market, what would you tell them?
Can I give more than one?
Please.
I think the first thing I would say is that, change takes longer than you expect it to, number one. And I would also encourage them to balance hubris and humility. Just because somebody's a good seller doesn't make them a good enabler or RevOps person. I learned that the hard way. And conversely, just because somebody's a good enabler and RevOps person doesn't mean that they really understand what's happening on the front line for a salesperson. That requires humility on both sides of the equation, right? Where the hubris comes in is where you do need to hold your expertise. And that is if you're just starting out in RevOps and enablement, if you're dedicated to becoming an expert in your craft, then you have to be able to show up and say, no, this is a best practice, and really apply some of that hubris. But it's a balance between hubris and humility. The more that you listen and the more that you hone your craft and execute your voice, striking that balance becomes easier and easier and more impactful to the business. So things take longer than expected, and a balance between hubris and humility is really key.
I love both of those. Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to see us today. We'll link to your LinkedIn in the show notes, and everybody can check out what you're doing there. But I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's been a fun conversation. Thank you.